Association of South Africa and Sakeliga, formerly Afri-Business, have jointly launched an urgent legal challenge against the implementation of the employment equity quotas and accompanying regulations. The date for that implementation is set to start on the 1st of September. The two organizations argue that the new framework, which introduces race and gender quotas across 18 economic sectors, violates constitutional principles and legal procedures. Let's speak now to Jaco Swart, who's the NEASA National Manager. Thanks for joining us this evening, Jaco. Let's start with the crux of this matter. What are the key constitutional and legal objections that NEASA have against the employment equity quotas?
Good evening. Yes, thank you very much. Well, first of all, in terms of the legal requirements that the minister was supposed to comply with before she could publish these quotas, she had to, in terms of the Employment Equity Act, publish drafts of these, both the sectors, to say identify the 18 sectors, as well as drafts, quotas, or draft targets, as they call it, for comment, for public comment. She had to publish for 30 days public comment, which she simply did not do. That's a requirement of the Act. Never happened. Secondly, she was supposed to actually consult on this and properly consult. There was no consultations. The so-called consultations that was held in February with the 18 sectors, which were never identified, were simply information sessions. Employers were called to these sessions by virtue of invitations, which we don't know was sent to whom, or where they got the list of whom they sent it to. And it was simply a session where people were informed of what the targets are. These consultations were generally about an hour long, and the presentations were 45, 50 minutes. So you had about 15 minutes to ask questions on these targets, which were not distributed at all. Most of the parties only received it the day before, or saw it for the first time at these consultations. So, how do you prepare for that?
Right. Go ahead.
Secondly, in terms of the target itself, it seems to be quite arbitrary. The Constitution requires that these types of affirmative action measures must be contextual, so they must take the context of society into account, as well as the specific sectors. So no context was taken into account. No credence was given to the attrition rates in sectors, or the growth rates, or the economic realities, or whatever is applicable in those sectors. Apparently, it's based on some sort of mathematical formula, which is completely arbitrary. And if you look back at from a practical viewpoint, these targets are simply impossible to meet. If you just look at from a sector perspective, the number of people which will need to be employed in a single sector far outstrips the economic growth and employment of the entire economy in a year.
So you're going to court based on two issues, the procedural issues and then the substantive issues as well. I'm interested, the Democratic Alliance also went to court and judgment was reserved in May. Why did you not join their court challenge?
Well, at that stage, the quotas or the targets weren't published, so they were actually challenging it kind of in a vacuum. They challenged the power of the minister to actually implement these targets. But a constitutional challenge saying constitutionally she should not have the power to implement targets at all. Although we also challenge that is the second part of our application. That's not the urgent part. The urgent part from our side is simply that the manner in which she introduced these targets was simply unlawful in terms of the Administrative Action Act.
All right. So we are expecting judgment around this time for the DA's case. And then depending on that judgment, will that impact your case at all?
Well, depending on what the basis of the judgment is and what the court finds. If the court finds that the minister never had the power, constitutionally speaking, to implement these types of measures, then our matter might become moot, although we do have different arguments that we might still proceed with in front of court, which might be in the interest of justice to get clarity on.
All right, so it very much depends on the judgment,
Correct.
Right. I'm interested in the substantive arguments that you bring. And there was a legal note from Baker McKenzie to their clients because, of course, any business over 50 employees has to prepare for the September deadline. And Baker McKenzie bring up the fact that there's a very, very high unemployment rate, the quarterly labor force survey, and they show that there's a very wide disparity between black people and white people in the unemployment numbers. How do you respond to that?
Okay, that's true. We cannot disagree with what the stats say. However, this type of social engineering does not resolve that problem. You're trying to replace one category of people with a different one. So you're only switching the unemployment rate from one category to a different one. It doesn't solve the problem. The way to solve the problem is to have proper economic policies, grow the economy, sort out the education system, get properly skilled employees, sort out the infrastructure, and basically get out of the way of the private sector, and they will grow the economy. And that will result in employment and resolve the inequality issue as well. So you can't, this type of government interference is not going to resolve that issue whatsoever.
Well, the question is, of course, that there's been 30 years and certainly the BEE legislation has been in place and it's been voluntary for a long time, and that hasn't necessarily achieved the results that the country would like to see. And so now the minister has to go ahead with quotas.
Yeah, well, there has been growth in employment equity, and we need to distinguish between BEE and employment equity. BEE is black empowerment; that's about ownership more than anything else. This is about employment on occupational level, and there has been a lot of growth, for the past 30 years, but because employers voluntarily comply or want to try to do this. But the problem is, obviously, there's not enough economic growth, so there's not enough employment opportunities. There's not enough attrition in companies because people stay in their jobs, so you can't really replace those people. And there's not availability of skills. If you look at what they're proposing, for example, in the education sector, on a high level in the sector, if you do a comparison between the employment equity report that was submitted by employers who are designated in the past and the proposed targets on the skilled level, you will need to employ approximately 55,000 African men over the next 5 years to reach their target. So either and at the same time, if it doesn't grow, reduce by about 50,000 women of all color, all races.
Okay, so, growing the economy is a very important point, but ensuring that the employment structures represent South Africa demographically and gender is also an important point. I want to just go to Ofense in Rustenburg, who has a question. Good evening, Ofense. Welcome to Power Business.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. No, my question and a comment is rather on how skewed the employment equity matter has been made out to be. As the gentleman is saying, he says it is disadvantaging a certain category of people over others. And generally when people speak like that is when they want to make employment equity about race. But it speaks about youth, it speaks about women, which also includes white women. It speaks about people living with disability. So if the gentleman can just clarify, at which part of the employment equity does it speak about disadvantaging or removing a certain category of people to make space for others? Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Ofense. Jaco, you want to answer Ofense's question?
If you'd just like to repeat it quickly, I didn't hear properly.
Okay, let me just give it to you. He's saying that it's employment equity is beyond race. We tend to just focus on race. It's youth, it's gender, it's also people from rural areas, and the employment equity legislation does not talk about disadvantaging one group over another. All right,
but it does that practically. Because you've got targets for certain races and genders, for that matter. I don't disagree. It's about gender and race and disabilities as well. But you've got targets for each one of these. So if I've got a target that says I am only allowed to employ 2% Indian women in my business on a certain occupational level, I've reached that 2%. Now I'm not permitted to appoint any other Indian woman, which is also a disadvantaged group. Can't do it. So she's got a barrier to employment now. Same with every category of person. Because if you can't, the regulations require you not to perpetuate the overrepresentation of a certain race or gender in your business. So once you've reached that, that's it. You cannot employ anybody from that category any longer.
Well, The issue, of course, is what would a fair and a representative
Yes.
workplace look like. I want to just go to Neo in Midrand, who also has a question.
Yeah, good morning, good evening. What is the alternative in order to ensure that black people are in the employment sector reflect the demographics of this country? What does this lawyer suggest?
All right, thanks. Now, just to clarify, Jaco Swart is representing the National Employers Association of South Africa. Please go ahead, Jaco.
Like I already said, you cannot swap people out. And I'm not saying you need to dismiss anybody. You cannot dismiss anybody for affirmative action measures.
Mm.
But what they attempt to do, if there's no economic growth, is to swap people out, just to switch around the employment rate. So what needs to happen? You need to grow the economy. You need to grow your skills. Employers employ on merit. They need to employ the best person for the position, irrespective of race, gender, color. Doesn't matter.
Mm.
That's a good business principle. And if that person is black or white or pink, it doesn't matter. No employer in his right mind will appoint the second best person based on the race or gender of that person. That's just stupid. From a business perspective.
Well, that's not necessarily the case. People like to employ people that they're familiar with, maybe they went to school with, they grew up in the same area. So there's a lot of bias that comes in when people are hired, and there's many studies that do show that people want to employ someone with even the same accent as them.
Yeah, let me ask you this. I'm a Muslim owner of a business. I've got a certain religion, a certain culture, a certain way of doing business, and I'd like to employ Muslim people which share my values, share my religion. Why am I not permitted to do that as a business owner?
Well, that's a small business owner under 50 and over 50. There's a requirement by the state to make it look representative of our country.
I'm not talking about a small business. I'm talking about a designated employer. Why can't I, as a Muslim business or as a Zulu business or whatever the case might be, appoint people who share my values and culture and understand the way I do business? What is wrong with that? I cannot run a business on a spreadsheet to say I can only appoint a certain number of people from this category or this category. It's not how business works. It's bad for business. You're going to destroy your business.
Okay, I hear your point. The way that this legislation was envisioned was so that South Africa would become a more fair and equal place. I think everyone can understand that South Africa does not represent an equal or fair place to go. So this was a way to do that. This might sometimes be something that people would not appreciate, and employment equity targets have existed in many countries, and it doesn't have to be there forever, but until the country reaches a more fair and equitable place, this is an opportunity for the country to get there.
The further problem is that it's a blunt instrument. Because there are no available skills. These targets are never going to be reached. The skills are not there. If you look at the transport industry, that's a male-dominated industry, or construction. It's male-dominated.
Yeah.
Simply because men tend to gravitate towards that type of job, and women don't.
But there's many levers that the state can pull, that the private sector can pull to get more women into construction, to get more women into mining, for example.
That's true, but it's not necessarily a job that women would like to do.
That's like, not necessarily true.
Well, if you just look at the stats, for example, nursing and cosmetology and education, those are the types of jobs women generally, not all women, gravitate towards.
Jaco, that's not true. If we look at Australia, where women are paid very well to go into construction, where they go into mining, there's many women there. But we'll continue this conversation, and we're taking your call.